I have to say, I never thought I would be saying things like this. I entered politics as a second career, or even as a third career. I first trained as a professional singer, and then at university I was a member of an idealistic cross-party group called the Young European Democrats. I joined Ford Motor Company, where I worked in sales and marketing in a building that we shared with Ford of Europe. I then spent 6 years in the venture capital investment world before being elected to Parliament in 1992. And it was only when I started to read about the EU treaties and how they operate that I began to have doubts about the direction of what we now call the EU. And there is a danger in this debate in becoming absorbed in too much detail, particularly economic detail, whether we are in or out of what people call the single market, or whether economists think the growth rate will be a shade higher or a shade lower if the UK is in or out. But this is to lose the meaning of this great question concerning the destiny of our whole nation in a forecasting margin for error. You can ask about how we will continue to trade with the rest of the EU after we leave, but there is no question at all that we will continue to trade. The Prime Minister himself told Andrew Marr, in or out of the EU, and I quote, "Of course the trading will go on." And the economic issues are not unimportant, but the economic case for neither Remain nor leave is decisive. The big facts are constitutional and about democracy, accountability, and nationhood. When an American president takes office, he swears an oath of allegiance. And I quote, "I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of the President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States," end quote. The biggest fact of all this is about the constitutional direction in which the EU is heading and intends to keep heading. So it would be impossible for a British head of state to honour the undertaking which is so central to the office which President Obama holds in the United States. This EU direction has been established for decades now. The reason the UK turned away from joining at the outset at the Messina Conference in 1955 is because it was already going in the wrong direction. We have spent 43 years of membership proving that we cannot change its direction from within. And today, the EU has never been less likely to change because of what successive governments have signed up to. From the moment we signed the Treaty of Rome, we subjected our entire parliamentary and legal system to the supremacy of EU law, albeit in a relatively limited way at the outset, but which amounted to a constitutional ratchet. As each new treaty was ratified, so new areas of policy or competencies were acquired by the EU. Even while the treaties were not being changed, the European Court of Justice has continued to operate according to what is known as, and I quote, "the doctrine of the occupied field," unquote. This means, once a power is acquired by the EU, it cannot be returned to the member states or withdrawn. It is a characteristic of a Supreme Court in any federal system. I first joined the House of Commons in 1992, when John Major decided to force through the ratification of the Maastricht Treaty. And I confess I made probably the worst mistake of my career. I read the Maastricht Treaty. Even while the Single European Act still largely limited the EU to trade and market matters, Maastricht was the step change in the legal and constitutional development of the European Union when the treaties included for the first time reference to home and justice affairs, to a common foreign and security policy which would lead to a common defence policy, and above all, we gave up any right to object to the principle that there should be a single European currency to replace national currencies, whatever the consequences for our own national interest. Maastricht was the critical turning point for the European Union. It marks the moment when we gave up effective control over the centralising direction of the EU. We gave the green light to the majority of the other EU states to forge ahead with the formation of the euro as I say, whatever the consequences for our own national interest. Not only has the euro proved disastrous for most of the eurozone economies, with tragic levels of unemployment, particularly for the young, not only has it divided our continent between the euro ins and the euro outs, and between the rich states and the poor states, but along with the steady accretion of powers and the increase in majority voting in the Council of Ministers, it has resulted in a fundamental shift in the balance of power in the EU, so that the 19 eurozone states now dominate, but most particularly Germany. And then when we ratified the Lisbon Treaty in 2009, which was almost identical to the EU Constitutional Treaty, which was rejected by popular mandates in France and Holland in 2005, this not only further increased areas decided by qualified majority voting, it brought foreign and defence under the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, along with Home and Justice Affairs, and along with the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. So I say to anyone who is not in the euro, any nation, and wants to remain outside the euro, and that certainly applies to the United Kingdom, have no illusions. If you vote Remain, you are not voting for some kind of status quo. You are voting for more of the same, to continue on the same trajectory. You are confirming, ratifying, consenting to this continuing centralising trend, which is hardwired into the treaties and into the institutions of the EU. Let me just mention one recent issue which should interest President Obama and which underlines how the EU's constitutional attrition on the UK's freedom to decide its own affairs is not just a threat to your security and safety, but our relationship with the United States as well. The Prime Minister told the House of Commons earlier this year, and I quote, "People in our country had fundamental rights long before the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights was even thought of, so we do not need these documents in force in Britain." Yesterday, the Home Secretary announced that the UK should leave the European Convention on Human Rights, warning that it can, and I quote, "bind the hands of Parliament," unquote. And yet still she advocates remaining in the EU. How logical is this? In 2013, a High Court judge, Mostyn J, in the case of R on the application of AB v Secretary of State for the Home Department, commented on how the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights includes rights that go beyond rights protected in the ECHR, and is now legally binding in the UK. In this case, a claimant asylum seeker wished to assert a right, the protection of personal data, which was not expressly protected by the ECHR, and which as such did not fall within the Human Rights Act. However, that right was contained in the EU Charter, raising the question whether it could thereby be relied upon in this case. Commenting on this, Mostyn J said, "It can be seen that the legal basis of the claimant's claim rests in part on alleged violations of the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union." When I read this, he said, in the skeleton argument on his behalf, I was surprised, to say the least, as I was sure that the British government, along with the Polish government, had secured at the negotiations of the Lisbon Treaty an opt-out from the incorporation of the Charter into EU law, and then by via operation of the European Communities Act 1972 directly into our domestic law. And he went on to comment that the Charter were based on his interpretation of a judgment of the ECJ known as the NS judgment. Referring to this, the judge said, "The constitutional significance of this decision, the NS judgment in the European Court of Justice, can hardly be overstated. The Human Rights Act 1998 incorporated into our domestic law large parts, but by no means all, of the Convention on Human Rights. Some parts were deliberately missed out by Parliament. The Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union contains, I believe, all of those missing parts, and a great deal more. Notwithstanding the endeavours of our political representatives at Lisbon, it would seem that much wider Charter rights is now part of our domestic law. Moreover, that the much wider Charter rights would remain part of our domestic law even if the Human Rights Act were repealed, end quote. So the Home Secretary's position is illogically wrong and constitutionally illiterate. The EU, whose law, unlike the ECHR, has direct applicability and direct effect, binds the hands of Parliament in a far more comprehensive manner than the ECHR. There is no point in leaving the ECHR and then agreeing to stay in the EU. Now, the point is this. On this basis, the ECJ has used the Charter of Fundamental Rights to bring surveillance by the UK intelligence agencies under its remit. In 2014, the ECJ struck down the Data Retention Directive, which required telecommunications companies to retain traffic data for the purpose of fighting crime. As a result of the ECJ's decision in the case of Davis, the Divisional Court in London annulled the Data Retention and Investigatory Powers Act 2014, which the Home Secretary had described as crucial to fighting crime, protecting children and combating terrorism, unquote. In October 2015, there was an even more important judgment in the Schrems case, where the ECJ reiterated its approach to surveillance when it struck down the so-called Safe Harbour Agreement, which regulated data sharing between the US and the EU. Part of our national security depends crucially upon the ability of GCHQ to share intelligence data with our American counterparts as part of the Five Eyes Security Alliance. But whatever the ECJ decides now, it is clear that it is in control of the powers that the intelligence agencies have to intercept communications. It is also liable to undermine the Five Eyes Alliance, on which British security has depended since the Second World War. And Mr. Obama, the US Attorney General who works for you, Loretta Lynch, has said that, and I quote, "It is certainly highly concerning to us that data privacy legislation advancing in the European Parliament might further restrict transatlantic information sharing," unquote. Now, this underlines an absolutely crucial point in this referendum debate. Nobody can seriously pretend what the government claims, either that the UK is in some kind of reformed EU, or that the UK has achieved some so-called special status, which are the principal claims the government put out in their taxpayer-funded document. We remain signed up to the EU treaties in full. The February decision, the Brussels deal, has not changed a dot or comma of those treaties. In fact, we gave up yet more control. In 2011, David Cameron vetoed the proposed Eurozone Treaty on Fiscal Union because it failed to resolve the relationship between the Eurozone ins and the Eurozone outs. Nothing has changed since then. But in February, the UK agreed the following text in the decision of the heads of government. Quotes, "Member states whose currency is not the euro shall not impede the implementation of legal acts directly linked to the functioning of the euro area and shall refrain from measures which could jeopardise the attainment of the objectives of economic and monetary union." That means we've given up the veto over the next fiscal union treaty, which we know is now planned in the 2020 President's Report. The former Governor of the Bank of England has just published a book called The End of Alchemy, in which he makes three things extremely clear. One, there is a Eurozone crisis. It hasn't gone away. Two, the Eurozone will collapse. Three, unless there is a new country called Europe. For as long as we remain in the EU of 28, we are but a minority of one. What will be the consequences for the United Kingdom if we are still an EU member, subject to all its laws and rulings, and forced to contribute to its budget when the euro does finally collapse? Or, how much influence will we have if the Eurozone continues its process of merging and those 19 countries do indeed form a new country they call Europe? The principal reason that leaving the EU will be good for the UK is there is much more uncertainty for the UK if we remain in than if we leave. I've always believed that immigration is good for our country, enriching our culture and good for our economy. But there are limits to how much we can take and how quickly. We're not in the Schengen border-free area, but the UK is subject to the Maastricht provisions on the free movement of EU citizens. The Treasury's own document last week based its forecast on net immigration into the UK of another 3 million people by 2030. The Home Secretary just days ago admitted that being subject to the EU principle of free movement makes it much harder to control our borders. What will happen when Turkey does gain visa-free access to the EU for all its 77 million citizens? And Ukraine has been offered the same. How will our NHS cope? How will our housing cope? Our schools? I only mention immigration because it is the most toxic telltale of how today's EU is so lacking in popular consent, as Labour's Frank Field is also indicating today. And it brings us to the constitutional and democratic truth, namely that the EU has control of more and more of the laws and policies which in a democracy people feel entitled to control for themselves. The EU is made up of democracies, but it is not itself a democracy. So as this power transfer continues, the EU is removing power from accountable democratic control and transferring it to something else, which most people would call a bureaucracy. It is what is known in the jargon in the EU's corridors of power as the democratic deficit, and everybody knows it exists. But you do not have to accept EU membership in this referendum. There is no moral, geographical, security, or economic imperative which requires it. In fact, the reverse is the case. As the Home Secretary also said yesterday, the UK is, and I quote, big enough and strong enough to be a success story in or out of the EU, unquote. However, it is imperative that we do leave, or the UK, the fifth largest trading nation in the world and Europe's leading defence power, continues to lose democratic control, autonomy over its own laws, and influence over its own destiny in the world. That is not in our national interests, or even in the interests of Europe, or in the interests of the world, or, I venture to suggest, in the interests of the United States. To leave the EU is not to leave Europe. It is merely your right to choose to be engaged with our European partners on a different basis. You do actually know far more about leaving the EU than about the consequences of remaining. You know that if you vote to leave, the UK will take back control over our own laws and our own ports of entry, and the UK will no longer be bound by the principle of free movement. You know the UK will take back full control of the £350 million per week we contribute to the EU budget. You know that we get back barely half of what we contribute in rebate, in farm support, in grants to science and universities and so on. So you know, and these are the official figures, that last year we made a net contribution of just under 10 billion to support our EU competitors. Since we joined in 1972, the United Kingdom has paid a staggering 508 billion gross into the EU budget. What was spent in the UK, or given back to us, we could spend better. The rest would be better spent at home rather than subsidising our relatively wealthy competitors abroad. So you know that what the EU currently spends in the UK on farm support or science research or universities or regional and structural funds will simply be funded direct instead of by the EU. Who is advocating anything different? Who in their right mind would use Brexit as a pretext to cut funding for farming or for science or for universities or for infrastructure when leaving the EU frees up billions we currently contribute to the other EU countries? There would also be new opportunities. We will not only regain control over our laws, our borders and our money. This government has started to try to rebuild our diplomatic representation and trade missions around the world. But we're also having to pay for the EU's fantastically grand network of so-called embassies for what they call their External Action Service. Outside the EU, we will be out in the world with far more freedom, energy and enthusiasm than ever. Exit from the EU is absolutely not about disengagement and shrinking from the world, quite the reverse. The Remain campaign has resorted to a number of stories. They call them, well, they are forecasts perhaps, but they're certainly not facts, about how dreadful it will be to leave the EU, for our young people, for jobs, for farmers, or for scientists, but all based on the most unlikely scenarios, like all farm support would be stopped, or that universities would be starved of cash or teaching staff without being in the EU. This is all just chaff. Any sensible government will take advantage of the spare money and legal freedoms which come with leaving the EU. You have to ask yourself, why did the Prime Minister offer this referendum if the choice is all one way? Wasn't that a fantastically irresponsible risk to take with the country if the consequences of leaving were going to be so bad? Of course, these are just campaigning positions and therefore not to be taken seriously. Most countries in the world are not members of the EU, and they are fine. Many non-EU countries trade with the EU, and very successfully, some more successfully than we do. Some 50 countries have free trade agreements with the EU. It is by no means essential for us, but why would the EU not conclude a free trade deal with the UK? Do you really think they will just be spiteful to us? Few developed countries outside the EU have the economic and unemployment problems which the Eurozone has inflicted on itself inside the EU. The idea that the UK will suffer outside the EU is not substantiated by any facts, and we should respectfully dismiss President Obama's advice. He is the president of a state which is so preoccupied with its own sovereignty that it is the only member of the United Nations that is not party to the UN Charter for the Rights of the Child and still refuses to join the International Criminal Court. It was foolish of the President to threaten British voters with going to the back of the queue when Australia negotiated a free trade deal with the US in less than 2 years. In any case, we have no free trade deal with the United States today because we are in the EU. So if we leave the EU, nothing would change. President Obama came to power on the back of the slogan, "Yes, we can." How sad that he should come back to the UK to say, "No, you can't. No, you can't control your own laws, your own courts, your own parliament. No, you can't have your own democracy." The UK ignored the United States in 1940 when President Roosevelt wanted Churchill to make peace with Mussolini. Should we have accepted their advice then? The UK ignored Ronald Reagan's pleas when his administration tried to persuade Margaret Thatcher not to take military action to retake the Falkland Islands. I have listened to so many Americans over the years insisting that it must be in our interest to join the euro. They were wrong then, and they are wrong now. They're still our friends, but listening to President Obama, it is worth remembering what Churchill often said: the Americans can always be trusted to do the right thing once all the other possibilities have been exhausted. Thank you very much.